Hey, it's David from the Redneck Garage. Tonight is a history lesson. I usually talk about cars and repairing things or complaining about something, but 150 years ago today, our little town, Franklin, Tennessee, had one of the bloodiest battles in the Civil War. As I look out tonight, when the sun went down, I thought about that carnage that happened in our little town. And I thought I would just describe some of it and give you a little bit of a history because it's pretty interesting. So basically, let's get this condensed down in the story, and then I've got some video clips and some pictures. There was no video taken during the Civil War, by the way. Okay, so you basically got two different forces. The Yankees were trying to get back up to Nashville, and the Confederates were thinking, okay, if we could cut them off before they get to Nashville, then maybe there's a chance to save the Confederacy. Of course, that was foolish to think, but Hood had been injured severely. He had one leg cut off, and he was wearing a prosthetic leg, and one arm was shot up, so when they had to strap him to his horse, he was a mess. Anyway, that was his plan, so he's coming up from Atlanta. Well, they maneuvered around, and they thought they almost had him at one point down near Spring Hill, which is where the Saturn plant is now. But the Yankees got around him in the middle of the night, and they came to Franklin, where I live. This is our town, Franklin, and they set up their stronghold because the river bridge was out. They couldn't get across the river to keep on going to Nashville, so they said, okay, we're going to wait here till we get the river fixed. Hood's coming up from the south. Schofield is here in Franklin, right? There's about 30,000 Confederate soldiers coming up to meet the Federal troops of 27,000. So you got these two big contingents in a town that only had like 1,000 people in it. Franklin was very, very small at that time. Okay, so here they are in Franklin. Hood's coming up from the south. What's going to happen? Well, it's getting kind of late in the day. The Union forces never thought that Hood would be as foolish as to attack, because they had already fortified the city. They'd gotten into Franklin. They built all these ditches. They had everything kind of so the Confederates coming up, it would have been a bloodbath. Anyway, they decide to do it. Hood's like, I don't care. He meets with his generals and says, you're going to do it. You're going to go in there and kill everybody, and we're going to take it over, and they're not going to get there. So you got Confederates marching up Columbia Avenue into the town, and you've got the Union forces here, and they're entrenched in there. Now, here's the other part of the story. There wasn't a lot of houses around at that time. So when the Yankees came into town, they took over the Carter's house as their command post. General John Schofield said, we're taking your house. You don't really have much to worry about because we don't think Hood's going to attack. It would be really stupid. And they're like, okay, fine. There was about 12 adults living in the house. Fountain Branch Carter lived there. He was a widower. He'd been there for about 30 years. He had 288 acres and about 14 slaves. Near the house was a cotton gin. And this is a picture of it. And that, after they interviewed everybody, all the soldiers from the war, that was one of the most recognizable landmarks. I always said the cotton gin, or they kind of gauged it from there, or the Carter house itself. The cotton gin was about 100 yards of the house, and I've got some video of where it would have been at the time. So they don't think they're going to attack. Now it gets late in the day, and it's about 4 o'clock. Hardly any battles in the Civil War were fought at night because, there's no light. It gets dark. That's when Hood attacked. So they're down in these trenches, and they're killing each other. Around the Carter house, it is a bloodbath. But let's do a little bit of video from around the Carter house. That's pretty cool. Okay, so this is about it, man. This is ground zero for the Civil War in Franklin. This is the Carter house. And gosh, when I was a little kid, I can remember coming out here. This building here, which was Mr. Carter's office, has the distinction of being the most battle-scarred building still standing from the Civil War. If you look close, you can see all the bullet holes. They were shooting this way, and you can see where a cannonball went through and where the wood was just knocked off. Those are all bullet holes. Yeah. There's no bullets in there now, But I can remember as a small kid putting my fingers in there thinking I might find a bullet. But over there on the back porch, you can see there's a door, steps going down, and the Carters, when the war was at its greatest rage, were down in the basement hiding. So a bunch of people are out here taking tours, and that's the front of the house. Right down the street is the Lott's house, and it was the Lott's family came over here during the battle and hid in the basement too because the artillery shelling was so great. One of the more tragic stories of the war was Todd Carter, which was the Carter's son, who had enlisted in the Confederacy, and he had been out and he'd been captured and released. And when they found out that they were going to travel to Franklin to stop the advance of the Yankees to Nashville, he said, "Come on, boys, I'm going home." And he was on his horse, and he was coming up this back way, probably about 200 yards from the house, and he was shot 9 times. After the battle, and the Yankees had started going north, back towards Nashville and continuing their journey, the Carter family came out of the basement, and with the help of one of their slaves holding the lantern, started looking through all the dead and wounded. And you can just imagine that picture in this backyard of just bodies stacked up like cordwood. And finally they came upon Todd with the help of 2 guys from Alabama. And he was probably somewhere around here. They carried him up to the house approximately 200 yards, put him in his sister's bed. He later died on December 2nd, never really knowing that he had made it home, which was really sad. And his last words were home, home, home. He had 9 bullet wounds. Here's the one of the older graveyards in Franklin. And this section was mostly the Carters as they passed away. They buried them here. And it's kind of trippy to think about 150 years ago next week, the Carter family was standing here burying their son after the Civil War, who died in the backyard of their home. Crazy. Mr. Carter's buried here. His wife's buried here. The Carters were one of the early families of Franklin, and it's getting harder to read the gravestones. But Mr. Carter died in 1876. He was born in 1822. But that's Todd's grave. Very tragic. Here's some trivia for you. That window above the door is very common in these older homes in Franklin, and what it was built for, a lot of people think, oh, that's cool. It signifies an open Bible, meaning that the light comes through, and means that the Bible is above the door, that they were believers, and that's what kind of that window meant. One of the neat things about old homes in Franklin, and we have a bunch of them, let me tell you, is that there's no closets. And everybody thought, oh yeah, it must have been hard to build a closet back then. No, actually it wasn't. These people were craftsmen. If you look at some of the stuff they built, it was amazing, right? But back in the days of the Civil War and subsequently after, the taxation system was different. So they taxed you on how many rooms you had, not the square footage of the home. So they decided not to build closets so they didn't have to pay as much tax. Interesting. That's the Carter's kitchen. And they built the kitchen separate because it burned down so easily. But the walk between the house and the kitchen was called the Whistle Walk. And that was their dining room over there. And you can see bullet holes in this house too. But this walk was called the Whistle Walk, in between the house and the kitchen. And as the servants would bring the food over, they had to whistle. And it wasn't because you wanted happy servants, but it's because the question would be, can you whistle with food in your mouth? And no, you cannot. So that would prove that they didn't eat the food as they were bringing it up to the house. But 150 years ago today, November 30th, the Battle of Franklin took place, and the Carters took refuge in that basement down there. Another interesting story is the door here on the back of the house. You can see there's a plate there. During the battle, it became so great, one of the soldiers took his butt of his rifle and knocked the hole through the door. and he went into the house to get away from the bullet fire. That you can see the bullet holes in the side of the house here. So he went inside the house. Years later, a very, very old man came by to visit the Carters, and it was that same soldier that had gone into the house for shelter, and his gun was still there, and they gave it back to him. How cool is that? But this is the back porch, and as they took refuge, this would have been ground zero for the Civil War here in Franklin. If you come to visit Franklin, there's all kinds of tours you can take and everything. I grew up here, so I pretty much know most of the history. But right here where the house is, as you look apart, across there where you see all those people taking that tour, there was a cotton gin, and this line kind of went parallel to here over to that way, and that was Claiborne, General Claiborne, Army of Tennessee. There goes a bunch of the tourists taking a look at the battlefield and the Carter house and everything that was going on here on the anniversary. This spot was the Civil War Domino's Pizza, and on this corner the soldiers got their pizzas before the war. Alright, this is Square in Franklin, Tennessee, and you can see that we have a rebel soldier up on the top of the Square monument. And during the war, actually, this was taken over by the Yankees during the War of Northern Aggression. But we've had this, I mean, when I was a kid, I used to come out here and we'd get up on the cannons. They just redid that. It looks really cool. We'd get up and sit on the cannons. Those are actually federal cannons. Those aren't Confederate cannons, which is interesting. People think they're rebel cannons, but they're not. But the Daughters of the American Confederacy put that up like in the early 1900s to commemorate the fallen. That's on like a West Main Street that runs through the center of town with the red flag. This is Chef's music. If you can imagine during the Civil War, you can see that red flag. And if you look around, a lot of the people have put red flags in front of their businesses. There's one. There's one. And what that signified is that these were used as field hospitals during the Civil War. There was such a huge amount of casualties for that time. They had to take people wherever they could to treat them. And during those days, the medical advances were so poor that usually what they did was lop arms off or legs off or whatever was injured. They wouldn't try to save it. The story goes that for years and years, if you were to dig up your flower beds underneath your windows, you would probably find human bones because there's so many casualties at the time. They would just drop the limbs out the window and later, just cover up the bones. That's how bad it was. But that's one of the red flags, meaning that this was used as a field hospital during the Civil War. Finally, in this picture, in the field hospitals, the ones with the red flags, you can see that even today, 150 years later, there's still blood stains on the floor, wooden floors. Usually those blood stains were out by the windows because they would set the tables out the closest to the windows that they could, and the reason for that is because of lighting. They didn't have any lights in the homes. There wasn't electricity. So to see well enough to chop somebody's arm or leg off or pull a bullet out, they would move the tables there. Sadly, during the Civil War, probably just as many people died from poor medical practices of infections, gangrene, things like that, than sometimes the actual wound themselves. So if you were lucky enough to not get killed on the battlefield, you're going to get killed by a surgeon's hand. So about 5 o'clock, it was dark, and they said that the bodies were so thick that they were stacked like cordwood. There was soldiers that were run through with a bayonet, and they couldn't even fall because the bodies were stacked so high. And so they found people just standing up dead. Anyway, one man who had fought in the battle, one of the soldiers, his statement of it was if the devil had full possession of the earth. It was awful. The Carter family decided, like I showed you in the video, they were down in the basement and everything happened. And, of course, Todd, that tragic story. 9 o'clock, the battle started to wane, and they had gotten the bridge fixed where they could go on. So the Union Army decides, okay, we're going to hightail it to Nashville because we've already beaten them pretty severely. bodies everywhere. Later, interestingly enough, the Union Army in 1865 will come back and take most of the bodies and bury them. The Confederacy was gone, so the McGavoks built what's Carnton. It's one of the few Confederate cemeteries in the United States. There's about 1,500 Confederate soldiers buried there that were interred that had been killed on the battlefield. So anyway, here's the stats on what happened at Franklin. For 5 tragic hours, basically you had 10,000 casualties. 3/4 of that were Confederate soldiers. 2,300 men died in those 5 hours, and 7,000 wounded. And you had about 1,000 prisoners taken. So clearly for 5 hours it was a bloody mess. So that's about it. That's the story of the Battle of Franklin. We have tourists that come in all through the year to look at some of the Civil War stuff that's around here, because it was a really cool piece of history as far as the Civil War, and it was near the very, very end, kind of the last gasp of the Confederacy. Hey, come on down. You can come tour the Redneck Garage and then actually look at some things that matter. I hope you enjoyed our little lesson tonight. I'm David from Redneck Garage. Keep turning wrenches.